Just to review making the loom, what we did was we used a ruler to mark every 1/4 of an inch, and then we took scissors and cut slots along the top. When you're all done, be sure to get your name on it. A little piece of tape helps with that. Then we selected a color for our warp thread and threaded the loom, going around and round both sides, up and down. It's important to pay attention to whatever side you think is the front. The back doesn't matter. The loom is not piece of the artwork. We're not going to keep the cardboard when it's done. We're just trying to hold the string in place for us so we can do the weaving. If you get to the end of what warp thread you have and you run out of string, you have 3 options for how to solve that problem. The first option is to add more warp thread of the same color. You begin as before, and you continue making the front of the loom look good. It doesn't matter if the back is a mess. The second option is to change the color of the warp thread. You don't have to stick with the same color all the way around. If you choose a different color, you'll end up with vertical stripes going throughout the piece. And the last option is to just leave it. You don't need to cut the cardboard. You can just stop a little bit early. If the back of the loom is driving you crazy with all the little pieces sticking out, a little bit of masking tape can solve that problem. The first weave that you should always start with is called Tabby Weave, also known as plain weave. You need to select the color that you want to use for the weft and cut off a little bit. Then you begin by going in an over, under pattern. So I'm taking the warp thread across, going over, under, or you could think of it like I'm picking up every other warp thread. And then I'm double checking that it goes over, under, all the way across. When you get to the end, pull the warp thread all the way through and stop when there's a little bit of a tail left. You take the end and you weave it back in just a few warp threads, doing the opposite of what the row below it did. So if it went over last, now you're going to go under. And you just leave that tail sticking out there on the end. Watch out that you don't pull it too tight. You want to leave that warp thread going straight, not pulling in. So be careful every time you pull your weft through. Be careful that you don't pull the warp thread in and warp the warp thread. Now you can continue going over, under from the other direction, doing the exact same pattern again. Just be careful when you pull it through that you don't tighten the warp thread too much. When you get to the end of each tabby, it's advisable to do something called beating down the yarn. That's where you take your hands, your fingers, and you push down the weft thread so that it's nice and even along the bottom, and the stripes you're making that go back and forth look even. When you get to the end of that row, guess what? You get to go back and do the very same thing again, the other direction. Beat it down and double check your work. All of the weft threads should be alternating on the warp threads as well. So I should be able to see an over, under pattern going up and down. You'll notice right here, there are three weft threads going over. So that looks like I made a mistake. See how it goes right here, it's over, but right here it goes under 3 times. So there's a spot where I made a mistake. All I got to do now is backtrack and pull some of it out and redo. Okay, so once that mistake is corrected, I can just keep going where I left off. Over, under, and so on. All the way across, back and forth. Gonna beat it down, and then I'm gonna double check. Over, under, over, and so on. Up and down and back and forth. It should always alternate with Tabby Weave. You're just going to keep weaving back and forth for a while until you feel like you've got enough of that color, or until you run out of yarn, whichever comes first. Okay, now suppose I run out of yarn or I want to change colors. How do I start a new weft? First, I have to take care of the end. Don't want pieces sticking out on the edge, so I'm going to leave a small amount and I'm going to weave it back in 3 or 4 warp threads and leave it on the end. When this is all done, I can cut it short and nobody will ever know it's there. I'm going to take the new color and go from the opposite direction. I'm not going to start where that tail is because sometimes it's confusing. And I'm going to check the row below. Whatever it did, I'm going to do the opposite. So with the gold there, I went over. So now I'm going to start under. And I'm checking that I'm doing the opposite from row to row. Under, over, over, under, all the way through. Then you weave it all the way across, just as before. Pull it through. And when you get to that end, you know what to do. You've got to weave it back over, under, so that it's not sticking out looking sloppy on the sides. At cleanup time, take your extra yarn and store it on the other side of the warp thread, and then you've got your name on the back. You're ready to put it away or in your book bag and continue tomorrow.